friends are since.
Any normal person that had spent countless hours writing, recording, and then eventually releasing an album you would think anyway, probably also dedicate at least a wee bit of time and energy into promoting it. The fiscally conscious option obviously would also be to coincide that promotion with something like Bandcamp Friday in order to maximise any potential return. However, believe it or not, as a Scottish person, I'm not especially good at tooting my own horn, so to speak. And so despite the fact that I just released a new album a few weeks ago called Brain Holiday, it felt much more natural for me to just, upload a wee quick Instagram post about it and then very swiftly move on to the next thing as if nothing had happened. Over the last couple of weeks though, I've come to realise that despite my innate inclinations in this area, saying practically nothing about the new album is probably not the smartest approach, especially when I've got a whole YouTube channel dedicated to talking about, making music. I guess that the honest truth is that I'm just not all that hugely bothered about whether or not you all rush out and buy the damn thing, and I don't feel much of a need to make a huge song and dance about it as a result. Now don't get me wrong, I would obviously love it if people listen to and enjoy what I've made, and I really, really appreciate those of you that have already or will in the future, but having played in bands since I was a teenager, I've long since given up of any delusions of grandeur and separated out the notions of satisfaction and success. And by that I think I mean that the act and process of creation is in itself rewarding, or at least good enough, and anything positive that comes after that is really just kind of a bonus. To that end, I thought it would make sense to give you something of an insight into that creative process and talk a bit about how exactly my latest release came into existence. When I was much younger, I remember quite vividly thinking about how cool it would be to be able to say I'd put out a whole album. And fast forward a number of years, more years than I care to count actually, Brain Holiday now marks the 17th album that I've written and released, either myself or as part of a band or other project. So I've learned some things along the way, even if I can't speak to the quality of any of those releases. And perhaps hearing about some of my experience this time around might prove useful, or at least, I don't know, encourage you to get your own music out there. And if not, at the very least, it gives me a great excuse to talk about my new release, and I can feel as if I've done some promotion. Before we dive in any further, you can find the new album over on Bandcamp at cowtonguetaco.com, and I obviously encourage you to give that a listen. This album was written almost entirely using a Dirtywave M8 over the course of the last year or so. I often gravitate towards the M8 because I find it really easy and natural to make music with trackers, but also because it allows me to manipulate sounds in interesting ways. It is also the main device that I use to play live with, and so composing on the M8 makes it much easier to then prepare the tracks for live performance, as I don't need to then reverse engineer everything to fit. When writing songs on the M8, I tend to start with a specific loop or a sample that I want to use, and will often feed it bits and pieces from my other gear, so melodies that I've recorded with my synthesizers or whatever else. Occasionally I will sit down with the intent to write something more up-tempo or with a particular feel, but I generally don't really ever have an idea of how a track is going to come out until I start writing it, and often actually not until the end, because they usually kind of just form themselves during the process. It's kind of a journey of discovery instead of one that I approach with real intent and deliberation, if that makes sense. I find that I'm most productive with music when I work fairly quickly, in the sense that I rarely am spending more than a few days total on each track. However, I also almost always finish songs in the sense that I get them to a stage where they feel complete in their own right. Whether I do anything with them or not, and whether they're good or not, is a completely different story, but I do want them to be finished, as it were. Now, I said that this album was written almost entirely in M8 because 3 out of the 13 tracks were composed purely with other bits of hardware. Specifically, Inside the Bubble was put together partly using Pro Tracker on my Amiga 600, and I think I used that largely for the drums, along with the Twisted Electrons and Blast Beats for wee bits of colour and ear candy or whatever you want to call it, and then the Twisted Electrons Mega FM for the melodic portions. Frolic Time was written using my modular system and composed with the excellent NerdSec Eurorack module. Finally, and now everything is made of cubes, used the Access Virus C as well as my Roland VP9000. I can't really remember exactly how I sequenced this because it was quite a while ago, but I suspect that it was probably with the Squarp Hapax, meaning that this is the only tune in the album that didn't involve any kind of tracker at all. Now, my approach to writing and finishing music means that over time I build up something of a large collection of very different tracks. I keep all of these organised, or at least documented, by putting all of the details of each of these into a Notion database, and that includes information on the main bits of gear that I've used, the working title, and then loose kind of groupings. So for example, in my head I've always got a few different ideas for projects on the go, in the sense that tracks written using samples that I have taken from Greek vinyl records probably will work well together, and maybe I'll put them out as a single thing. Similarly, can never say that word, more experimental modular type tracks might form another grouping, you know, that kind of deal. I keep exports of all of these tracks in a single folder called MP3 prevs or prevs, you know, previews, if you get it. And I regularly, another word I can't say, will put these into different playlists and just listen through them. Over time, I found that groups of these tracks then naturally coalesce, sometimes in line with the particular projects that I already have in mind, but other times just in a totally different way from what I might expect. In the case of Brain Holiday, it was kind of the latter experience, in that I had, without realising it, built up this strong set of more whimsical, down-tempo tracks that I'd kind of overlooked because they weren't necessarily the sort of thing that I was playing live. And all of a sudden, they just kind of fell into place, and that I was listening one day and I went, oh, this is an album now. Once I know that I've got enough tracks that make sense together as an album, I then move fairly quickly through the final stages towards actually putting the thing out, because that isn't really a process that I necessarily enjoy. I find it to be more technical and laborious than creative, if I'm being honest, with some notable exceptions like the track list and all the rest of it. For the final bits of production, I use iZotope Ozone 9 to master the tracks, giving them that final wee polish and bring them up to a decent volume. This was not the cheapest bit of software around, to be honest, but I find it has the best combination of quality and accessibility for somebody like me that is definitely not a mastering engineer. And I got the entire iZotope product suite a few years back when it was on sale for a massive discount. There are far newer versions of Ozone available now. I think we're up to 11 or something like that. But 9 is, as far as I'm aware, the last one that can be run as a standalone application, which just makes more sense for my particular workflow and way of thinking. So that's why I've stuck with that. With tracks that I've written on the Dirtywave M8, I generally do all of the mixing in the M8 itself and render a mix with enough headroom down to master. I could and might in future export the separate stems from the M8, so I've got the 8 separate tracks and put them into Logic so that I can mix and process them further or to a deeper degree, though I haven't really felt the need for that before. In terms of the actual process that I go through, I load all of the tracks into Ozone and then I run the mastering assistant over each one as a first pass to get a kind of starting point. From there, I will add in and adjust the various modules to get the sound I want, including the EQ and compression. I'll add in a wee bit of excitement, stereo spacing, etc. before I export them all to a single folder as a first draft. This is where we enter the most tedious part of the whole process as far as I'm concerned, where I have to listen to the tracks over and over again, tweaking the masters to make sure that they sound good together as a cohesive whole. It is also at this point that the running order starts to come together, in the sense that as I'm listening through and making notes, I'm also considering the position of each track in relation to one another and how they all flow, rearranging them to fit, trying out different combinations, as well as determining whether or not there should be more or less of a gap in between each track depending on where they fall. For Brain Holiday this time around, I put together a spreadsheet so that I could keep track of each round of changes much easier, and that helped a lot, though this naturally all takes some time to do because there is only so much you can listen to the same music over and over and over again before you start to lose all sense of perspective and sanity, to be honest. Ideally, I do try and listen to the final drafts on different headphones or speakers, and I will play them when I'm DJing as well so that I can hear them in a bigger sound system and get more of an idea of how they'll sound, particularly in the lower end, though I'm not really especially precious about doing all of this to an extreme degree. I know people get really sniffy about how You should, you know, do the car test. You should listen to them on 15 different sets of speakers in acoustically treated rooms and all that kind of stuff. But this is not some major commercial release, right? So if they sound good in a couple of different sets of headphones, then that is usually good enough for me. And in terms of headphones, my favorite pair that I use for almost everything is the Metsi 109 Pros, and I've done a video on them a while back. This is not a sponsored reference, I just like them. Up until this point, I usually only have working titles for each of the tracks, and these are most commonly just a reference to where or when I was writing a particular tune, or a nod to a specific sample that I've used, so they aren't especially meaningful in any way. Because of this, whilst I'm going through and listening to the tracks and making tweaks to the masters and everything else, I'm also christening them with their final names. This particular album draws heavily from things that some of my close friends have said, as well as experiences that we've shared over the last few months, and these match up nicely with the feeling of each track, as well as then feed into the overall concept or theme of the album, which is more dreamy, floaty, and maybe even kind of introspective in a way. But I do spend quite a bit of time finding names that work with the, you know, the track itself. I'm not just plucking them randomly. There is a bit of thought and, well, less thought and more just feeling, heart, let's say heart. Lots of heart that goes into that. The artwork for this release was created using Midjourney, which I know a lot of people aren't a fan of for a variety of reasons. Lots of perfectly good reasons. But without getting into all of that, in an ideal scenario, I would love to be able to hire an appropriate artist to come up with or realise a specific idea for every release I make. However, whilst this is something that I've done in the past and will do again in the future, it has actually been really difficult to find somebody that is able and willing to create something that fits the music in the style that I want, and also do so at an affordable price. The simple fact of the matter is that I really can't justify paying £100+ to somebody to come up with artwork for a release which I might only be partially happy with, and which only a handful of people are ever going to buy digital copies of anyway, so it is what it is. In terms of the process itself though, I generated about 50 different images using Midjourney, telling it the title of the album and guiding it with various prompts in different directions to see what it came up with. There were some really freakishly strange results actually, including some that reminded me of King Crimson. But in the end, I was pretty pleased with what I got, and I think it fits the style and vibe of the music fairly well. Once the album is all ready to go, the next part is, you know, actually getting it out onto places where people can get access to it. In the past, I've put out physical releases on CD, vinyl, and cassette tape, but more often than not, now I'm just doing digital releases only. The cost and or amount of effort that you need to expend into a physical release, particularly one with, you know, individualized artwork and all that kind of stuff, only to wind up with piles of stock left over and having spent more money, it just isn't worth it. As I've mentioned already, I share my music in Bandcamp primarily, as I find that is where I not only have most control, but also the greatest potential to actually make any money at all. But the reality is that most people, including myself to be honest, use something like Spotify or Apple Music to stream stuff on the go, and so to get your stuff onto these platforms, you need to use a digital distributor. From my experience, there aren't any really good consumer level digital distributors that I've found, though there are some that are especially untrustworthy, such as Amuse.io. And if you want to know more about that, I've done a whole video on it recently, but I would 100% avoid them. DistroKid is a fairly popular option that you see pop up as YouTube sponsors all of the time, and I was using them myself for a while, but they limit the number of artist names that you can release under, and also operate on an annual subscription model. None of this is much use to me, as I put out music under lots of different names and as part of lots of different projects. So I ended up shifting my entire catalogue wholesale over to CD Baby fairly recently, because with them you pay just once for each release, and you aren't then tied into the same kind of limitations on artist name and everything else. And I should say that they're not sponsoring this video, although they fucking should be. Each of these distributors have got varying splits in terms of royalties and the amount of money that they take from what you earn from the streaming services. However, as we all know, nobody's making any cash from these anyway, or at least I certainly am not. So whether the royalty split is 20%, 50%, or even 100%, it really makes no difference. and that doesn't really factor into my calculations, but it might into yours. So that is an overview of what my process has been like for this latest album. As we already know, I haven't really put any effort or attention into promoting the damn thing outside of this video, of course, but I'm pretty pleased with it. I think it's one of the best things I've put out, to be honest. And so if you're interested, you can have a listen to it and hopefully buy a copy over on the Cow Tongue Taco Records Bandcamp, which is kind of an imprint where I share a lot of my stuff as well as releases from friends as well. So, you know, have a browse about there. As something of a lukewarm thank you, if you've made it this far throughout this ridiculous video, then you can use the discount code BrainHolyT or BrainHolyT. It sounded clever when I did it, but I can't really say it properly out loud. I'll just put it on the screen here. But if you use that code on Bandcamp, you can get 20% off the album too, which is like a couple of quid or something like that. If you're on my Patreon though, you will already have access to all of this and all of the other stuff I've uploaded already. So, you know, go log in and you'll find it there. It actually works out cheaper if you just buy a 1-month subscription to Patreon and then download everything you want and then cancel. So that is an option if you want to do it that way. I won't be watching. Well, I will. And I'll probably be judging you as well, but that's fine. We all do these things. In the meantime, if you've never put out an album before, then hopefully this has shown that it really doesn't need to be that difficult at all. So, what are you waiting for?